She trusts the label. She trusts the brand. She has no reason not to. The box says Cerelac, Nestlé's baby cereal, the best-selling baby cereal on earth. Lab tests, 20 countries, 90% positive. For sugar, undisclosed, unlabeled, added on purpose. Now picture the same box in Switzerland, where Nestlé is headquartered. Zero added sugar, every time, guaranteed. Same company, same recipe file, same year. One version for African infants, a different version for Swiss ones. Here's the second thing nobody tells you. For years, this water wasn't natural. Nestle filtered it illegally, in secret, then sold it as pure at a markup up to 400 times the price of tap water. France's own government knew about it and said nothing for at least 2 years. In the last 2 years, Nestle has lost two CEOs and a chairman. One CEO fired for hiding a relationship with an employee. The one before him fired for missing every target he was given. And this isn't old news. As of yesterday, Nestle is selling its entire water division, the same one built on the fraud you just heard about. So here's what this video actually answers. This is the company that invented baby formula to stop infants from dying in 1867. So why, 159 years later, is it still under criminal investigation for the exact same kind of harm? Strategy Lens exists for one reason. Every company tells you a story about itself. We read what's underneath it instead: the filings, the court records, the internal memos nobody was supposed to leak. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what's really running the companies you buy from, work for, or invest in, you're in the right place. Subscribe, and you'll never look at a grocery aisle the same way again. Now, back to the empire. In 1867, a 53-year-old pharmacist's apprentice named Henri Nestlé looked at a public health crisis and decided he had the answer. He wasn't a food scientist. He wasn't even Swiss by birth. He was born in Frankfurt, trained in pharmacy, and had spent decades in Vevey experimenting with everything from fertilizer to gas lighting before he landed on the product that would define him. The crisis was infant mortality. In the 1860s, a staggering number of European infants died before their first birthday, and a large share of those deaths were tied to a single brutal problem: babies who couldn't be breastfed. For medical reasons or because their mothers had died, had almost nothing safe to eat. Nestlé's answer was farine lactée, a powder combining cow's milk, wheat flour, and sugar, designed as a substitute for breast milk. He tested it first on a premature infant in Vevey who couldn't tolerate his mother's milk or any other food available at the time. The baby survived. Nestle had his product, and, importantly for what comes later, he had his origin myth, a company that quite literally saved a baby's life on day one. Before infant formula, Henri Nestlé had already failed at or abandoned half a dozen other businesses. He'd bottled mineral water and lemonade, manufactured fertilizer, and dabbled in gas lighting, all in that same stretch of Vevey. He was not a specialist who set out to solve child nutrition. He was a serial tinkerer who happened to land on maybe his 7th or 8th attempt on the one product that mattered. His wife, Clementine, doesn't appear on the company crest, but historians researching the Nestlé archives credit her with recognizing what her husband had actually built. She was the daughter of a doctor who ran a charity clinic, and by most accounts, it was her read on the scale of the infant death crisis, not Henry's, that pushed the product from a local curiosity into something marketed as a genuine medical solution. That myth is not incidental. It is the DNA this entire video is going to keep returning to. Nestle was not founded to sell chocolate or coffee or bottled water. It was founded to solve infant nutrition by a man who'd spent 2 decades failing at almost everything else he tried. Everything the company is today was added later, on top of that first single success. Nestle wasn't alone for long. A year earlier, in 1866, two American brothers, Charles and George Page, had set up the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company just up the road in Charm, using Switzerland's abundant fresh milk supply to produce condensed milk for industrial European towns under the brand name Milkmaid. For the next 3 decades, these two companies were rivals in the truest sense. Anglo-Swiss started selling infant cereal. Nestle started selling condensed milk. Each one copied the other's product line almost feature for feature, competing street by street across Europe, then continent by continent, as both expanded into the Americas, Asia, and Africa. The rivalry wasn't gentle. Both companies undercut each other on price in every new market they entered, which is a detail worth remembering. The aggressive, margin thin, growth at any cost posture that defines Nestle's later history didn't start once the company got big enough to afford it. It started when the company was still small enough that losing the price war might have ended it. The rivalry ended in 1905 when the two companies merged to form the Nestle and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. By the time the ink dried, the combined company already operated more than 20 factories and, this is the detail that matters, had started building overseas subsidiaries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Australia. Read that again. In 1905, before the First World War, before radio advertising existed, before almost any other consumer goods company had thought seriously about what global even meant, Nestle was already selling infant nutrition products into the parts of the world with the least regulatory oversight, the least access to clean water, and the least ability to hold a Swiss company accountable if something went wrong. That wasn't a side effect of growth, it was the growth strategy. To be clear about what this section is not saying, nobody in 1905 could have predicted the exact shape of the scandals to come. Henri Nestlé himself died in 1890, 15 years before the merger, and never ran the global company his name became attached to. But the pattern was set before he was even in the ground. A product engineered for infants who can't defend themselves as consumers, sold aggressively into markets with the fewest safeguards, marketed by a company answerable primarily to shareholders thousands of miles away. That pattern didn't start in the 1970s. It didn't start with a scandal. It started with a business plan. By the 1920s and 30s, Nestle had refined a marketing playbook that would later become one of the most examined case studies in the history of consumer advertising. The method was simple. Dress company representatives as medical professionals and position the product as scientifically superior to what a mother's own body could provide. Then distribute free samples through hospitals and maternity wards until a newborn's digestive system adapted to formula and breastfeeding was no longer physically possible. Company literature from the period, later cited extensively in the boycott campaigns of the 1970s, described these representatives internally as milk nurses, women given uniforms deliberately similar to real nursing staff, sent into maternity wards across the colonial world specifically because a uniform carried more authority than an advertisement ever could. It worked. It built one of the most trusted consumer brands on the planet in dozens of countries, well before most competitors had a footprint outside Europe at all. It also planted, more than a century before this video was made, the exact seed that would put Nestle on the receiving end of the largest consumer boycott in corporate history. We'll get to that, because first, this small Swiss condensed milk company needed to become the largest food and beverage company on earth. And the story of how it did that is, on its own, one of the most aggressive expansion campaigns in the history of capitalism. Here is the private briefing version of how Nestle got this big, the parts that don't make it into the About Us page. In 1930, the Brazilian government had a problem, a catastrophic coffee surplus, so large that Brazil was reportedly burning beans it couldn't sell. The Brazilian Coffee Institute approached Nestle's chemists with a strange request: find a way to condense coffee into something that could be stored indefinitely without losing its flavor. It took 8 years. In 1938, Nestle launched the result: Nescafe, the world's first commercially viable instant coffee. The timing was either brilliant or extraordinarily lucky, because a year later, the Second World War began, and instant coffee turned out to be exactly what modern militaries needed: lightweight, shelf stable, easy to ration. Nescafe became a staple in American soldiers' field kits, and Nestle exited the war with a household name across an entire generation of servicemen who brought the habit home with them. What happened next is the part most people have never actually seen laid out. Nestle didn't grow mainly by inventing new products. It grew by buying other people's trust, one household name at a time. Maggi seasonings and soups, absorbed in 1947, Libby's in 1971, Stouffer's in 1973. Then, in 1985, Nestle acquired the American food giant Carnation for $3 billion, a deal that brought Coffee Mate into the portfolio. The following year, almost as an afterthought next to a $3 billion acquisition, Nestle quietly founded a small internal division called Nespresso. Nobody at the time treated it as a major event. 4 decades later, Nespresso alone generates several billion francs a year and is one of the very few parts of the company still growing without controversy attached to it. A reminder that not everything in this empire was bought. But the acquisition that actually tells you who Nestle is happened in 1988, and it's the one most documentaries skip past. Roundtree, the British confectioner behind Kit Kat, was underperforming, vulnerable. Nestle's managing director, Helmut Mauker, offered to ride in as a white knight. Then Nestle did something it had never done in its history. It turned hostile, outbidding its own rescue offer for £2.55 billion. Nestle's own shares, under Swiss corporate law at the time, were structured to be effectively takeover proof. Nestle spent 1988 forcibly acquiring a company that could never have done the same to it. The predator was, by design, unhuntable. And here's the second irony. Rowntree had signed away the rights to Kit Kat in the United States to Hershey in 1970. To this day, the company that owns Kit Kat everywhere else on earth cannot sell its own product in the largest economy in the world. Notice the pattern in the word choice: underperforming, vulnerable. That's not incidental language. It's close to Nestle's actual acquisition thesis. Nestle's genius was never spotting undervalued brands. It was recognizing exactly which proud, struggling companies were one bad year away from needing a buyer. 4 years later, in 1992, Nestle bought Source Perrier, instantly becoming the global leader in bottled water. Keep that acquisition in your head. We are coming back to it, and when we do, it's the single biggest reveal in this entire video. The buying never really stopped. Gerber, the baby food brand synonymous with American parenting, bought in 2007 for $5.5 billion. Pfizer's infant nutrition division in 2012 for $11.9 billion, one of the largest deals in the company's history. And this matters for where this video is going. The buying didn't stop in some distant era. It kept going almost to the present day. A $7.15 billion deal in 2018, Nestle simply paid Starbucks for the permanent right to sell Starbucks branded coffee in grocery stores worldwide. Add it up, and Nestle has completed more than 70 major acquisitions since the 1970s alone. Today, it owns over 2,000 brands. What Nestle actually built wasn't a portfolio of products, it was a portfolio of local trust. Every one of those brands kept its name, its packaging, its national identity on the shelf, while the decisions about what goes inside the box quietly moved to Veve. Totole, the seasoning brand in a huge share of Chinese kitchens, has been Nestle owned since the 1990s, with no Nestle branding anywhere. Garoto, one of Brazil's most beloved chocolate brands, has been a Nestle subsidiary since 2002. Thomy, the condiment brand that dominates Swiss and German kitchens, has been part of the company since the 1960s. None of them carry the Nestle name. All of them fund it. That structure is either the smartest thing a consumer goods company has ever done, or it's the reason that when something goes wrong inside one of those boxes, almost nobody watching from the outside can tell whose decision it actually was. We're about to find out which. In 1939, a doctor named Cicely Williams, working in Singapore, documented something she called bottle baby disease, a pattern of malnutrition and death in infants that tracked disturbingly closely with formula feeding in communities without clean water or the money to use the product correctly. She called out the industry by name. Almost nobody listened for another 3 decades. In 1974, the British charity War on Want published a pamphlet called The Baby Killer, accusing formula companies, Nestle chief among them, of aggressively marketing infant formula in the developing world, where mothers often mixed the powder with contaminated water or over-diluted it to make an expensive product last longer. When a German student group translated it, they gave it a new title, Nestle Kills Babies. Nestle sued for libel and won in a Bern courtroom in 1976. But the judge who ruled in Nestle's favor added something the company didn't want printed in any headline. He urged Nestle to fundamentally rethink its marketing practices. Nestle did not take the advice. In July 1977, a coalition called the Infant Formula Action Coalition launched a consumer boycott out of Minneapolis. Within months, it was a national campaign. Within a year, Senator Edward Kennedy was holding hearings on Capitol Hill, where a Nestle representative asked directly whether the company bore any responsibility for infant deaths linked to unsafe water used to mix its formula, said this: "The company could not be held responsible for the water supply." That answer did not go over well. The boycott spread. By 1981, the pressure had produced something with actual teeth: the World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. Stripped of the legal language, the code says a handful of specific things. No advertising formula directly to the public. No free samples. No use of health worker imagery. No claim suggesting formula is equal or superior to breastfeeding. The boycott lasted close to 20 years. Nestle has spent decades insisting it now operates within the WHO code everywhere it sells. Advocacy groups to this day publish annual reports alleging ongoing violations. In April 2024, the Swiss watchdog Public Eye, working with the International Baby Food Action Network, sent field investigators to buy Nestle baby food products across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. They tested 150 products from brands including Cerelac and Nido. Then they tested Nestle's own European versions of the same products, sold in Switzerland, Germany, and the UK, for comparison. The European samples had zero added sugar. Almost every wheat-based Cerelac sample from the lower-income markets did not. A WHO scientist, Nigel Rollins, called it exactly what it looks like, a double standard that cannot be justified. Remember the milk nurses from the 1930s? Public Eye's investigators found the 21st century version of the exact same tactic. Parenting influencers on social media promoting Cerelac as healthy, content indistinguishable from medical advice. Same tactic, same use of borrowed authority. Different century, different screen. Nestle's response was to quietly fix it in one country. Under pressure and after a drop in its India-listed share price, Nestle reformulated 14 Cerelac variants sold in India, removing the added sugar. It did not do the same in Africa. A follow-up investigation in November 2025 tested Cerelac across 20 African countries and found added sugar in 90% of them, at levels 50% higher than in Asia. 19 African civil society organizations sent an open letter directly to Nestle's CEO. Its central line is worth hearing. If added sugar is not suitable for European children, it is not suitable for children in Africa, regardless of nationality or skin color. Nestle disputes the characterization. Its official position is that it does not have double standards and that formulation differences reflect local regulations and ingredient availability. This video is presenting it alongside the lab results so you can weigh both. A French Senate investigative commission spent months in 2025 interviewing more than 120 people, including Nestlé's own CEO, and concluded that the French government at the highest level had covered up the fraud. On-screen text, direct from the Senate report. The presidency of the Republic had known, at least since 2022, that Nestlé had been cheating for years. The Commission's rapporteur said investigators estimate the total fraud at over 3 billion euros. Consumers had been paying up to 400 times the price of tap water for a product that was neither pure nor untouched. One official refused to testify entirely, Alexis Kohler, at the time the Secretary General of the Élysée Palace, who the report says had spoken with Nestle executives repeatedly, by phone and in person. When President Macron was asked about the scandal in a February 2025 press conference, he said he was not aware of these things and that there was no collusion with anyone. The Senate's own findings, published 3 months later, directly contradict that account. Remember the business plan from Section 3? A Swiss company, answerable primarily to shareholders, thousands of miles from wherever the product actually lands. Here it is again, except this time it's not a market with weak oversight. It's a G7 government, allegedly protecting a Swiss company's word over its own citizens' right to know what they were drinking. The Senate investigators went further, describing what they called a deliberate strategy of concealment, dating back to the very first government meeting on the issue in October 2021. According to their timeline, officials spent months quietly negotiating with Nestle on a technical fix, replacing the banned treatments with a different filtration method rather than disclosing to the public that a decade's worth of natural mineral water might not have been natural at all. Which raises the obvious next question. If a G7 government would quietly help hide the truth about what's in a bottle of water for 2 years, how much confidence should anyone have in what gets caught and what doesn't inside a can of baby formula? We're about to answer that. But first, one more piece of the machine. How the raw ingredients get to Nestle's factories in the first place. Roughly 70% of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa, much of it from Ivory Coast. In 2005, 6 men from Mali sued Nestle USA and the commodities trader Cargill, alleging they had been trafficked into Ivory Coast as children and forced to work cocoa farms up to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Farms that supplied cocoa to both companies. Neither company owned the farms directly. Both provided the farms with training, equipment, and cash in exchange for the exclusive right to buy their crop. A level of economic leverage, the plaintiffs argued, came with a responsibility to act on what the companies knew or should have known was happening. In June 2021, the case reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled 8-1 in Nestle and Cargill's favor, not on the underlying question of what happened on those farms, but on a technical, jurisdictional point. The conduct in question occurred entirely overseas, so a specific 18th century American statute didn't apply. A lower court later dismissed the case again in 2022 on the grounds the plaintiffs couldn't prove which specific farms out of a supply chain covering the vast majority of Ivory Coast's cocoa production their labor had actually gone through. The allegations were never tried on their merits. 2 decades earlier, in 2001, Nestle and the rest of the chocolate industry had signed a voluntary pledge, the Harkin-Engel Protocol, to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from cocoa supply chains by 2005. That deadline was missed. So was the revised 2008 deadline. So was 2020. Independent researchers funded by the US Department of Labor have continued to find child labor in West African cocoa farming at rates that, by some measures, have not meaningfully improved despite more than $150 million in industry spending. That's the mechanism behind the chocolate bar. not a single villain making a single decision. A supply chain deliberately structured with enough distance, legal, geographic, and corporate, that responsibility becomes almost impossible to pin on any one address. One more piece of the machine: how Nestle actually grows versus how its earnings calls describe it. In the most recent reporting period, price increases alone contributed more than the actual volume moving off shelves. That's a company generating revenue less by selling more and more by extracting more from the same people buying the same amount. But hold it next to Nestle's own mission statement: unlocking the power of food to enhance quality of life. Because a growth engine built mainly on price increases describes something narrower and more familiar: 2000 trusted brand names used as pricing power, one grocery run at a time. Put these three threads next to each other, and a pattern starts to look less like coincidence. A baby food company selling two different products under one promise of consistency. A water company laundering banned signs through a word natural that a government helped protect. A chocolate supply chain built with just enough legal distance that a Supreme Court case about child slavery could be won without anyone actually answering whether it happened. Three different products, three different continents, one identical shape. Sell the story, protect the story, and let the fine print absorb whatever the story can't survive. Coming up, what happens when all three of those stories start collapsing in on the company at the exact same time? This section is built entirely on the last 3 years, nothing older. Because what's happening inside Nestle right now doesn't need historical context to be alarming on its own. August 2024, a turning point in the timeline. In August 2024, Nestle's board removed CEO Mark Schneider after years of underperformance and missed growth targets. His replacement, a 38-year Nestle veteran named Laurent Frex, took over on September 1st, promising a turnaround built on getting back to basics. He lasted exactly 1 year to the day. September 1st, 2025, 1 year to the day. On September 1st, 2025, Nestle's board fired Frex with immediate effect. The official reason? An internal investigation found he'd had an undisclosed romantic relationship with a direct subordinate, a clear breach of the company's own code of conduct. An anonymous tip through Nestle's internal Speak Up hotline had triggered a first review months earlier that found nothing. When further complaints came in, the full board, led by Chairman Paul Bulcker and lead independent director Pablo Isla, ordered a second investigation with outside legal counsel. That one confirmed it. Frex denied it to the board until the end. He left with no exit package. His replacement was named the same day, Philip Navratil, who joined Nestle in 2001 as an internal auditor and was, at the time, running the Nespresso business. Nestle had now churned through two CEOs in 13 months. Weeks later, Chairman Bulcker announced he'd step down too, handing the role to Pablo Isla, the same director who had just helped run the investigation that got Frex fired in the first place. One of Nestle's own major shareholders, a governance specialist at the investment firm Deka, put it plainly to reporters: losing two chief executives and a chairman inside a single year is, for a company this size, close to unprecedented. Back in 2017, activist investor Daniel Loeb built a multi-billion-dollar stake in Nestle and publicly accused the company of exactly the dysfunction now playing out in the headlines. Too slow, too complacent, stuck in its old ways, in his own words. That was 9 years before this video. The pressure worked, briefly. Then, by most of the metrics that matter, it didn't. By the time Frex was fired in 2025, Nestle shares were trading close to 40% below their 2022 highs. Full year 2025 results showed sales of 89.5 billion Swiss francs, but net profit had fallen 17%, down to 9 billion. Then, in July 2026, days before this video was made, Nestle reported its first half 2026 results. Organic growth had actually improved up to 3.6%. But net profit for the first 6 months of the year had collapsed by 31%, down to 3.5 billion francs, driven largely by restructuring costs and write downs on businesses the company is actively trying to get rid of. Underneath that headline number, the segment detail is worse than the summary suggests. Pet care, long considered Nestlé's most dependable growth engine, saw North American sales dented by retailers deliberately shrinking their inventory levels. Nespresso, the quiet in-house success story from Section 4, reported softening consumption for the first time in years. Several European retailers temporarily delisted Nestlé products entirely during pricing disputes. And infant nutrition, specifically, posted a sales decline attributed to the lingering effects of the formula recall. Growing sales, collapsing profit. That combination is usually what a company's balance sheet looks like when it's in the middle of tearing itself apart in order to put itself back together. November 2025, a critical marker in this timeline. In late November 2025, during a routine equipment check at a Nestle factory in the Netherlands, engineers detected trace amounts of a toxin called cerulide, a heat-stable compound produced by certain bacteria that doesn't break down even when boiled. Further testing confirmed it was present in finished infant formula. Nestle says it informed Dutch authorities and the European Commission on December 10th. That same day, 25 batches were pulled from shelves in 16 countries, quietly, without a public announcement, in what food safety advocates would later call a silent withdrawal. On December 24th, Nestle traced the contamination to a single ingredient, an oil additive used to support infant brain development, sourced from a supplier used across multiple factories. The delay, a silence that lasted for 6 weeks. The public recall didn't go out until January 5th, 2026, nearly a month after regulators were first told, and roughly 6 weeks after the contamination was detected. By then, Austria's health ministry says more than 800 products from over 10 factories worldwide were implicated. Danone and Lactalis, which used oil from the same supply chain, issued their own recalls days later. Eventually, close to 60 countries were affected. A Dutch consumer rights group, Food Watch, filed a criminal complaint in Paris on behalf of 8 families who say their infants developed repeated vomiting, diarrhea, and fever after consuming the recalled formula. On January 30th, 2026, Paris prosecutors opened 5 separate criminal investigations into Nestle and 4 other manufacturers, examining possible charges including endangering infant health and failing to act on a food safety risk in time. France's health ministry is investigating 3 reported infant deaths in cases where recalled formula had been consumed. As of the most recent update, no causal link has been confirmed. The investigation is ongoing. We are stating that as precisely as the public record allows, because this is not a detail to speculate about. What is confirmed? British health authorities alone documented at least 9 clinical reports of babies showing symptoms consistent with the toxin, part of a wider cluster of 36 suspected cases across the country. Dutch authorities confirmed 4 babies fell ill. Belgian and Luxembourg regulators confirmed a direct link between consumption and illness in their own jurisdictions. What is under active investigation? Whether any of it contributed to a death. That's arguably one of the smartest adaptive moves in this entire video. We'll give Nestle full credit for it in a moment. But it's also a reminder that even the company's best current instincts are playing defense against a structural shift in how the entire world eats. On top of a leadership crisis, a profit collapse, and a criminal investigation into the one product category the company was originally built to get right. 3 CEOs worth of turmoil, 3 billion euros of alleged fraud, 3 continents worth of recalled baby formula, all of it, all at once. So what does a company like this actually deserve? Credit, blame, or both? Every company in this genre gets reduced to a villain or a victim. Nestle is neither. It's something more useful to understand. A case study in what happens when real competence and real dysfunction sit inside the exact same organization, often inside the exact same decision. So let's be precise about both. Precise and clear. First, the diversification. A portfolio of over 2000 brands sounds like corporate bloat, and in some ways it is. But it's also the reason Nestle has survived scandals that would have ended a smaller company. When the water division is mired in a fraud investigation, the pet food division keeps generating cash. When infant nutrition sales drop after a recall, coffee and Nespresso keep the balance sheet upright. Look at the number underneath all the bad headlines from Section 6. Even in the same half year that net profit collapsed 31%, free cash flow actually rose up to 3.4 billion francs. A company genuinely coming apart doesn't generate more cash in its worst quarter. That's not luck. That's 70 years of deliberate portfolio construction, and it works almost exactly as designed. Second, the science investment is real. Nestle spends roughly 1.7 billion Swiss francs a year on research and development across 22 R&D locations and 4,000 dedicated staff. Nestle Health Science has built genuine clinical credibility in categories like clinical recovery nutrition and metabolic health, the kind of products actually prescribed through hospitals and dietitians rather than sold off an end cap. It's a smaller, quieter part of the business than the confectionery aisle, but it's arguably the closest thing left to Henri Nestlé's original mission, run with modern clinical rigor instead of a uniform borrowed from a real nurse. Borrowed from a real nurse. Third, and we said we'd give credit here, the GLP-1 response has been genuinely fast. While competitors publicly shrugged off weight loss drugs as a rounding error, Nestle built and shipped an entire product line for that exact consumer within months and started re-engineering existing recipes around a scientific finding about taste perception that most of the industry is still only starting to study. Now the other side of the ledger, and these are structural, not incidental. First, governance. This is where the machine is breaking. Two chief executives and a chairman gone within 13 months is not bad luck. It's the visible symptom of a succession and oversight process that failed twice in a row at the highest level of the company in full public view. Second, the reflex toward containment over disclosure. Look at the pattern across two completely unrelated crises. With Perrier, Nestle's own account says it flagged the treatment problem internally in 2020 and didn't fully resolve the public reckoning for nearly 5 years. With the infant formula recall, the company's own published timeline shows roughly 6 weeks between detecting the contamination and telling the public. Different divisions, different continents, same instinct. Contain first, disclose only once containment fails. Third, portfolio strain. The conglomerate structure that used to be Nestle's greatest strength is now colliding with three forces at once. A generational shift toward clean label food with fewer additives, the GLP-1 disruption to snacking volume, and Nestle's own accumulating trust deficit across multiple product lines. A structure built to be resilient to any single scandal is being tested by several scandals landing in the same 18-month window. So, what would a genuinely smarter version of this company actually do differently? Not vague corporate language, but specific moves. 1. Build disclosure timelines into food safety and quality protocols with the same rigor as financial reporting deadlines, because the lesson of both Perrier and the recall is identical. The delay is what turned a containable problem into a criminal investigation, not the underlying defect itself. 2. Separate succession planning from personal politics entirely. With an independent conduct and conflict of interest review built into every executive appointment before it's announced, not after a whistleblower hotline forces the issue. 3. Finish the divestiture strategy with an actual endpoint in mind and say publicly what Nestle is choosing to be. Right now, the market is watching Nestle sell pieces of itself one earnings call at a time with no stated final shape. A company this size either controls that narrative or lets a falling stock price write it instead. Which brings us back to the question this video opened three separate loops on. Why is Nestle the most acquisitive company in the history of the food industry? A company that spent 150 years buying everything in sight, suddenly selling. Here it is, stated plainly. This is not confidence. Confident companies expand from strength. Nestle is contracting from exposure. Every business unit it has agreed to sell or spin off in the last 12 months is either the direct site of a scandal or a category the company can no longer defend as core to its future. The divestitures aren't strategy dressed up as crisis management, they're crisis management dressed up as strategy. That's not a reason to write Nestle off. Companies this size rarely collapse outright. They shrink, restructure, and often come out leaner on the other side. But it is a reason to stop reading every corporate press release as a plan and start reading it as a symptom. What that means depends on where you're sitting. If you're an investor, it means the free cash flow is real, but you're buying into a multi-year cleanup, not a growth story. And the dividend that's made Nestle a byword for stability has now leaned on rising debt to stay intact. If you're one of the 271,000 people who work there, it means the next round of cuts is a question of when, not if. And if you're just a parent standing in a grocery aisle, it means the label in your hand was quality tested by the same systems that took 6 weeks to tell you something was wrong. Here's the framework worth taking away. Look at what a company was originally built to solve. That founding problem is never fully finished. It's just managed quarter by quarter forever. And the surest way to predict where a company's next scandal comes from isn't its stock price. It's checking whether the thing it was founded to fix is still quietly unfixed. For Nestle, that thing was trust. It has been managing that exact same problem since 1867. It still hasn't solved it. Nestle didn't build the largest food company on earth by selling milk or water or chocolate. It built it by selling the idea that a Swiss corporation could be trusted with the most vulnerable moments of a stranger's life. Every scandal in this video is just the bill for that promise finally coming due. If this video changed how you see something you buy every week, that's the entire point of this channel. We're building the place people come when they want the version of the story the company itself would never greenlight. Subscribe and you'll see the next one before anyone else does. Nestle didn't build an empire by feeding the world. It built one by making the world trust it enough to stop checking.